Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scotland Gladiator. So let's talk a little bit more about these fantastic Dane axes or great axes from Tord at Thor's Forge, linked below. And you know, before I start, I should just mention once again, Tord made these to my spec, to my order. And I have literally personally never handled Dane axes which are as gorgeous as these to handle, as responsive and light and well made and accurate compared to the ones that I know in the Museum of London. And they're just absolutely lovely, and man, I just can't get over how much I love that shape, and I love the way he's left the dark and the contrasting bright blade on this one. And of course he sent two of them. I'm going to be holding the modern steel version for this, and the reason is because I've been getting to know my axes a little bit better. So in previous videos, so I've talked about the housecarls and the Dane axe or great axe, and some ideas about how maybe they were used, but I didn't have one before, and Tord made a couple for me, and I've been slowly, when I get time and when it's not snowing and when I've not had a cold, you can probably hear my voice is a bit strange at the moment, getting used to how these move, how they maybe were used, just trying to get to know the weapon, I suppose, kind of making my hands and my body familiar with the way that this handles and the way this moves. Part of that is cutting up bottles. We're going to have a little look at that in a moment. Water bottles, before I start, water bottles are, you know, not a particularly accurate, they're not historically accurate target. They don't necessarily tell us what it would be like to, you know, hit someone wearing armour or not wearing armour or anything else. It's really just because it's a standard measure, so I know how lots of other things cut water bottles. So it's quite interesting for me to attack a water bottle with an axe for a change, because there are things that are different about that. Now, obviously, I have hit water bottles with just about every type of weapon. Axes, even maces and warhammers, but mostly swords. And one of the things that has to be said is a water bottle is quite tough on the outside because it's plastic and it has no resistance on the inside, so it's very, very different to something like tatami mat. Obviously it's very different to meat, but nevertheless it can instruct you, it can show you a few things. For a start, if you get your edge alignment wrong, water bottles are very unforgiving. You will not cut a water bottle if your edge alignment is bad. So for learning edge alignment, water bottles are obviously free, so they're good for that reason, but they're also quite a good free testing material to test your edge alignment. The other thing that has to be said is actually light, fast blades have an advantage on water bottles. So using a heavy, slow blade, which might cut meat, it might cut a person or a large animal or a tree very effectively, like a wood chopping axe, it will chop a tree down, but it won't cut water bottles very effectively because it's a relatively heavy and slow moving weapon, and also the edge geometry is not really conducive to cutting through water bottles. Dane axes are a little bit different for a number of reasons. Number one, they are lighter and correspondingly better balanced, shall we say, than something like a wood chopping axe. They have a narrower angle at the edge, so they're essentially sharper. They are literally sharper as well, generally speaking. Obviously you can make a wood chopping axe razor sharp if you want, but these are, this particular axe is very well sharpened. It's as sharp as most of my swords are. Tord did a great job on that. I haven't done any sharpening on it at all. He did a fantastic job there. But because of the angle at the edge, they're relatively speaking finely edged. They're more like swords actually in some ways than some other axes are. But that being said, they have commonalities with other axes in that all of the weight is at the head of the weapon. They're very tip heavy, in other words, and of course you've only got a limited blade length. Now this is a very interesting thing, as we'll see in the video, when it comes to chopping bottles, because a bottle is a fairly narrow target. It's about the width of someone's calf, maybe, depending on the type of bottle, could be the size of their thigh. But you know, you're talking about a limb, a person's limb, and actually trying to hit something that's only that wide with something that's only this wide it is harder than it is with a sword, because obviously a sword, you have a full, it just so happens I have a Viking era sword behind me, I'd forgotten that. You have this much blade to intercept that limb with. With an axe, you only have this much blade. So clearly an advantage of swords is that you have a longer length of blade to intercept whatever you want to hit. Little bit, your distance judgment therefore has to be much better with the axe, but we'll see that in a second. So generally speaking, I was surprised at how easy it was to cut water bottles with this axe. Not because I know that axes cut things very, very well, and this is very well made, very sharp. But what surprised me is my previous experiences show me that heavier, slower moving objects can struggle with water bottles. Even some fairly large, heavy swords can struggle with water bottles. Whereas a light, quick sword like a rapier, some of rapiers, a side sword or a sabre, they usually glide through water bottles, so long as you get the edge alignment right. So I didn't know fully what to expect from the axe, and all I will say is, and you'll see in a minute, I was very surprised at how easily this took water bottles apart, despite the fact you have to remember, okay, we've got some added length and leverage because it's a long shaft, which helps definitely, but generally speaking, a tip-heavy weapon will accelerate more slowly than something like a sword, which is more balanced towards the hand. You can therefore accelerate more quickly. Anyway, let's have a load more talk, let's have a look at the cutting videos, and I'll make a few comments as we go along. So here you can see that initially I go to cut the thing with my hands at a kind of medium spread, so a little bit of way up from the pommel end or butt end, and not that close, so, you know, kind of in the middle of the shaft as it were, with a fair distance between the hands. So this is, I would call this a kind of conservative hand placement. Okay, so it's not completely choked down you know, near the head, and equally it's not holding it all the way down at the bottom end like you'd hold a sword. And here we see the results. Here we see what happens when I put the hands further down at the bottom of the shaft. So obviously I gain extra reach, but the weapon becomes, relatively speaking, more unwieldy because obviously I'm holding it further away from the point of balance. So I've gained reach at the expense of, shall we say, control or responsiveness. But I probably added power because although it's probably harder to accelerate the weapon, once it's moving, it's got a hell of a lot of inertia, momentum in the head, and it's swinging with a very long lever. So I've added a lot of leverage to the force I'm swinging it with. But it's harder to judge the distance. It's harder to get that relatively short axe blade to meet the relatively narrow bottle that I'm trying to hit. So your distance judgment has to be that much better. Here we see what happens if I bring my lead hand right the way up nearer the head. So I'm much shortening my reach. I'm bringing myself closer to the target. This is the sort of thing you might do in close combat if someone closes you down. Or indeed it might just be, you know, maybe you're fighting against someone with a shield or something like that and you just can't get a long distance swing at them, or you're fighting in an enclosed space, or all sorts of reasons why you might want to do this. And as we can see, the axe is still an effective cutting weapon even when you have a much shorter amount of shaft in front of your lead hand. Here I swap over to the left hand side. If we look at the Bayeux tapestry, we actually see that a lot of the housecarls using two-handed axes are actually holding with their left hand in front. Usually this is what a left-handed person would do with a two-handed weapon or a longsword, but you know, this is more awkward for people who are less used to it. It may be just random that they showed it in the Bayeux tapestry, or there may be some reason why they were using axes from the left-hand side, perhaps to bypass the shields of their opponents. So here we have a go cutting from the left hand side and see how that goes. This is an attempt at essentially a punch or a push away. It's almost like a thrust, but obviously this weapon doesn't have a point on the end like a halberd or a poleaxe would do. So I'm essentially thrusting with the edge to see the effectiveness of that. I use a smaller bottle correspondingly because I realise it's not going to be so effective as a swing, very clearly. But I'm really very happy with the effect that just a simple, essentially thrust or punch has with that axe blade. It is very sharp, it's got mass to it, and of course you've got quite a lot of body and force behind it once you've got it moving. But it was quite a slow moving weapon, so I was quite impressed by how well it went through that plastic. And finally, what we see here is me attempting to choke right back on the weapon at the butt end and keep it almost in a continuous swing, a bit like how we see the montante or spadone used, the large two-handed sword, in much later centuries, to keep it in continuous motion, to see if I can keep it moving and then put a good cut in during that motion. Now, the challenge that I had was the distance judgment, and this comes back to the point I made earlier about the fact that we've only got a blade of a certain length and we're hitting something that's about limb diameter, and it's quite hard to get those two things to intersect and meet exactly. The result being that I essentially slashed the bottle. The first slash goes through and spills half of the contents of the water from the bottle all over the floor. The result of this is the bottle now only weighs roughly half as much as it did before, so when I hit it, it's more likely to fly away from my axe rather than actually being cut by the axe. With the second cut, I essentially did the same thing. Again, I slashed it, so half of my blade passed through half of the bottle. And now there's only roughly a fifth of the water left in the bottle. There's very little in there, so I thought, what the hell, I'll have a final swing at it. You never know what will happen. All I can conclude is that the axe hit the bottle with a hell of a lot of force, smashing it into my fence in an amusing fashion. It was a lot of fun, but it didn't cut anything because at this point it's essentially a hollow, empty plastic bottle with no resistance really to my axe blade. So I hope that was somewhat interesting. Obviously this is all anecdotal and it's plastic bottles, and we can't make too much of this experiment. It's not the most scientific thing in the world, but we can say a few things. The first thing that I've noticed is one of the most difficult things using an axe is actually judging your distance, because if you're trying to hit something that's relatively speaking narrow, and bear in mind that even people's bodies and heads don't have very much depth, and you're trying to hit something that's maybe at most that wide, and if it's an arm or a leg maybe as little as that wide, with a blade that's only this long. So distance management actually becomes quite difficult, and a lot of the time I think when people were hit with axes, they only actually would have been hit by a portion of the blade, either the top portion or the bottom portion. It's only really if you manage to get the centre of the target meeting the centre of your axe blade, which is quite difficult when both people are moving around. As we saw here, it was even difficult enough against stationary bottles. But only if you hit middle on middle are you likely to completely pass through like you would with a sword. So the advantage, one of the advantages of a sword is you have a long blade, so it's more likely to completely lop off a body part. If you're aiming at someone's neck or leg with an axe blade, there is a very large chance that you will only go partially through it and not completely sever that body part. That was something that I guess I knew, but I hadn't had so graphically illuminated in my brain before. A real light bulb went on and went, yeah, of course, that's a big disadvantage of axes. That being said, you can feel in your hands the huge amount of power you get from a two-handed axe. I mean, any type of axe punches above its weight in terms of impact on the target, because it's a tip-heavy weapon. Most of the weight of that weapon is near the tip, and it's sharp. So you've got the advantage of an edged weapon and kind of the advantage of a mace put into one. Axes are very, very effective. But with a two-handed axe, you've got a huge amount of leverage and a relatively long blade. So you're really getting some of the advantages of something like a two-handed sword with some of the advantages of an axe, or all of the advantages of an axe with the Dane axe. It's an incredibly formidable weapon. That being said, it's not especially quick, it's not especially nimble, although equally it's not especially slow either. It's fairly, the fact that you can move the hands on the shaft and change the range and use it in very different ways, including punching at extremely close range. I mean, this is ignoring the fact that we can do things with the butt and the shaft as well. Just the head end, we can punch with it, we can use it at moderate reach, or we can completely come back to the bottom end and use it like a two-handed sword. But really, distance management is always going to be an issue with axes, and I think that's very, very interesting. The other thing I found very interesting is that this moves fast enough, or accelerates fast enough, to glide through plastic bottles without very much trouble at all. And I've literally shown all the cuts I did today, so not that many, in this video. I didn't have any duffed cuts at all, apart from the one you saw at the end there. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting for you guys to watch. Once again, I am super pleased with what Tord at Thor's Forge, link below, has done with this axe. You can get axes like this, or other types of axes. I saw he was making some bearded axes yesterday, I think, from Tord. Talk to him about what you want. He does other things as well, swords, spears, saxes, all kinds of stuff. But this is really a work of art. I'm in love with this axe. It's absolutely lovely, and I'm going to enjoy chopping lots more things with it and sharing more of my discoveries with you guys. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.